What if the Imperium's greatest threat wasn't the ravenous Tyranids, the corrupting forces of chaos, or even the soulless Necrons rising from their tomb worlds, but something far older, far stranger, something that bends the very fabric of reality itself? Something so terrifying that even the God Emperor's finest warriors would rather face extinction than confront it in battle? Deep within the sprawling archives of the Administratum, buried beneath millennia of bureaucratic records and forgotten war reports, there exists a classification so rare that most Imperial commanders will never encounter it in their entire careers. It's marked with a single word, written in High Gothic, accompanied by a symbol that resembles a broken hourglass. The word is Hrud, and beside it, in red ink that has faded but never quite disappeared, 3 letters that strike fear into even the most battle-hardened veterans, RTA, refuse to approach. The first authenticated encounter happened on a mining colony called Verdus, Tertia. Though the official records claim it was lost to an orc invasion, the truth is far more disturbing. When the relief fleet arrived, expecting to find wreckage and bodies, they found something impossible. The colony was intact. Every structure stood undamaged. Every door remained sealed. But inside, the exploratory teams discovered a nightmare that defied all understanding. The colonists were there, all 7,000 of them, still at their posts. But they were corpses. Not recently killed corpses, mind you. These were bodies that had aged centuries in what should have been mere days. Men and women in their prime reduced to mummified husks, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Their equipment had rusted to fragments. Their clothes had rotted to dust. Even the walls around them showed signs of extreme age, paint peeling, metal corroding, stone crumbling. Yet the rest of the facility remained pristine, untouched by time. The tech priests examining the scene found something even more disturbing in the colonists' personal chronometers. According to the devices, only 3 days had passed. 3 days during which these people had experienced what appeared to be 300 years of aging. The Mechanicus could offer no explanation. Their instruments detected no radiation, no toxins, no biological agents. Just impossible readings of temporal distortion that shouldn't exist outside of the warp itself. But this wasn't the warp. This was something else entirely. The Hrud are not like other Xenos species the Imperium has cataloged. They don't build grand empires like the Eldar once did. They don't wage wars of conquest like the orcs, or seek to devour all biomass like the Tyranids. They don't even seem to want territory or resources in any conventional sense. They simply exist in the dark spaces between humanity's worlds, dwelling in the forgotten tunnels and abandoned hive levels, in the derelict ships drifting through the void, in the places where light and hope have long since died. Ancient records, some dating back to before the Age of Strife, describe them in fragments and whispers. Hunched, skeletal figures wrapped in ragged cloaks that seem to absorb light itself. Creatures that move through shadows as if they were doorways, appearing and vanishing without warning. Their faces, when glimpsed, are said to resemble rodent skulls covered in leathery, wrinkled skin. But these physical descriptions are almost meaningless because to see a Hrud clearly is to invite the very phenomenon that makes them so dangerous. They radiate entropy itself. Time accelerates around them, not through some technological marvel or psychic power, but as a fundamental aspect of their existence. It's as if they carry with them the heat death of the universe, concentrated into a field that extends meters or even kilometers depending on their numbers. Stand near a single Hrud and you might age years in minutes. Enter a warren where thousands nest together and you could experience decades or centuries in the span of hours. Your armor corrodes, your weapons jam and crumble. Your augmetics fail catastrophically. And your body, your fragile human flesh, withers and dies as time itself becomes a weapon turned against you. The Adeptus Mechanicus has a theory, though it's one they whisper about only in the most secure of laboratories. They believe the Hrud don't generate this temporal field intentionally. It's not a defense mechanism or an attack. It's simply what they are. As if they exist partially out of sync with normal spacetime, creating a kind of temporal wake wherever they go. Some radical tech priests have even suggested that the Hrud might be refugees from another time entirely, displaced by some catastrophic event in the galaxy's distant past or unimaginable future, condemned to wander through an era that is not their own. The Imperium has tried to fight them, of course. After Verdus Tertia, after dozens of similar incidents on frontier worlds and space stations, the High Lords authorized extermination campaigns. Entire regiments were deployed into suspected Hrud warrens. The results were always the same. The soldiers who went in young and strong emerge, if they emerged at all, as ancient dying men, their weapons useless rust, their armor flaking away like dead skin. Even the vaunted Space Marines, with their enhanced biology and millennia of combat experience, found themselves helpless against an enemy that didn't need to fire a shot to win. One particular incident has become something of a legend among the Inquisition. A company of Iron Hands, a full 100 Astartes warriors, descended into a hive city's underbelly to purge what was believed to be a moderate Hrud infestation. They maintained Vox contact for the first 3 hours, reporting heavy temporal distortion and accelerated equipment degradation, but pressing forward regardless. Then the transmission changed. The voices became older, weaker, confused. One battle brother claimed he had been fighting for decades. Another spoke of watching his armor rust away over what felt like years. The last transmission was from the company captain, his voice barely a rasp, begging for extraction and claiming that 40 years had passed since they entered the warren. When the recovery teams finally reached them, only 6 days had elapsed on the surface. But the Iron Hands they found were elderly beyond measure. Their enhanced physiology pushed past all breaking points. Most had already died, their gene seed degraded beyond recovery. The few survivors lived only days more before their bodies finally gave out, ancient and used up, despite being chronologically still in their prime. The Mechanicus examined their remains and found bone density consistent with Space Marines who had lived for half a millennium. Their neural implants had degraded as if they'd been active for centuries. Even their black carapace, that remarkable interface between armor and body, had begun to calcify and crack like ancient leather. And yet, the Hrud themselves remained unseen throughout the entire engagement. No bodies were recovered. No casualties were confirmed on their side. They had simply been there, existing in the darkness, and that existence alone had been enough to destroy one of the Imperium's most resilient fighting forces. This raises a question that nobody in the Imperium's vast military apparatus wants to answer. If even Space Marines cannot stand against the Hrud, what happens when they decide to emerge from the shadows in force? What happens when these time-warping aliens stop hiding and start moving through Imperial space with purpose? Because according to certain classified reports that only the highest levels of the Inquisition have access to, that moment may be closer than anyone realizes. The reports began appearing approximately 2 centuries ago, though their significance wasn't recognized until recently when a particularly perceptive Inquisitor named Shevek made a connection that everyone else had missed. Scattered across dozens of sectors, seemingly unrelated incidents shared a disturbing pattern. Hrud sightings were increasing, not randomly, but along specific vectors. They were moving, migrating, and their direction suggested something that sent cold dread through everyone who understood the implications. They were fleeing from something. The Hrud don't build cities or monuments. They don't leave behind ruins for archaeologists to study or texts for historians to translate. But they do leave marks on the places they inhabit. And these marks tell a story if you know how to read them. On a forgotten research station orbiting a dead star, Mechanicus explorers found walls covered in strange scratches, patterns that their most advanced cogitators eventually interpreted as astronomical charts. Not charts of the present galaxy, but projections of stellar positions thousands, perhaps millions of years into the future or past. The calculations required to create such charts would challenge even the greatest minds of Mars, yet the Hrud had carved them into metal walls with what appeared to be their bare claws. In the underhive of Necromunda, a gang of scavengers stumbled upon a Hrud gathering site abandoned so recently that the temporal distortion still lingered in the air, making their chrono displays spin wildly. Among the debris, they found objects that shouldn't exist. Alaskan manufactured in a pattern that wouldn't be invented for another 3 decades, according to Mechanicus records. A child's toy from a world that had been destroyed 500 years earlier. A piece of armor bearing the heraldry of a Space Marine chapter that had yet to be founded. It was as if the Hrud existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, collecting fragments from across the centuries like ravens gathering shiny objects. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from an unlikely source. A rogue trader named Severina Hax, whose warrant of trade granted her access to regions of space most Imperial citizens would never even hear about, encountered something in the eastern fringe that changed everything the Imperium thought it knew about the Hrud. Her ship, the Eternal Prophet, was investigating a series of energy signatures near an unexplored system when they detected a massive vessel drifting in the void. It was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, and constructed from materials that predated human spaceflight by incomprehensible ages. Hax, never one to let caution override curiosity or profit, ordered a boarding party. What they found inside defied all rational understanding. The vessel was a Hrud Ark ship, though calling it a ship seemed inadequate for something so vast and ancient. Corridors stretched for kilometers, their walls composed of a dark material that seemed to drink in light and warmth. The boarding party's lamps created pools of illumination that extended barely a meter before being swallowed by absolute darkness. Their thermal sensors detected nothing, as if the very concept of heat had been erased from existence within those halls. They found chambers filled with what could only be described as temporal machinery, though no tech priest could explain how it functioned. Massive spheres of crystalline substance suspended in fields of distorted space, each one containing what appeared to be moments frozen in time. A drop of water hanging in midair, never falling. A spark of fire, forever burning but never consuming. A single heartbeat, captured and preserved. The boarding party's leader, a veteran Voidmaster who had seen wonders and horrors across a dozen sectors, later testified that standing in that chamber felt like standing at the end of all things, watching the universe wind down to its final, inevitable silence. But it was in the deepest part of the Ark, in a chamber so vast they couldn't see its walls, that they found something that would haunt their nightmares forever. The Hrud were there, thousands upon thousands of them, maybe millions. Not living, not exactly. They were in some kind of stasis, suspended in fields of frozen time. But here's what made Hax's blood run cold and convinced her to flee back to Imperial space with her discovery. Every single one of them bore wounds. Terrible wounds. Burns that could only come from weapons humanity had barely begun to theorize about. Trauma consistent with temporal displacement, so severe it had literally torn them apart at the atomic level. The Hrud weren't just fleeing. They were survivors of something. A war, perhaps. A catastrophe. Something so terrible that it had broken one of the galaxy's oldest species and sent them scrambling through time and space in desperate search of safety. And when Hax's tech priests analyzed the temporal signatures around those suspended Hrud, they discovered something even more disturbing. The wounds were recent. Not in terms of when they occurred, but in terms of when they would occur. The Hrud had been wounded by events that hadn't happened yet. They were fleeing backward through time from a future that terrified them. This revelation prompted the Ordo Xenos to launch a comprehensive investigation into Hrud behavior patterns across the last millennium. What they found was a timeline of migration that tracked with other significant galactic events, but offset in ways that suggested the Hrud could somehow sense temporal disturbances before they occurred. 300 years before the Tyranid hive fleets arrived in Imperial space, Hrud populations in the eastern fringe began moving toward the galactic core. 50 years before the 13th Black Crusade, Hrud warrens near the Eye of Terror started emptying as their inhabitants fled deeper into Imperial territory. Even the Great Rift's formation was preceded by massive Hrud movements as if they could feel the warp storm coming decades before it tore reality apart. They weren't just refugees. They were oracles, reading the future in ways that even the Imperium's most powerful psychers couldn't match. But they couldn't change what was coming. They could only run from it, carrying with them their temporal wounds and their impossible technology, searching for moments in space and time where they might find safety, even if that safety lasted only for a brief span of subjective years. And now, according to the most recent reports, the Hrud were moving again. Not in small groups or isolated warrens, but in numbers that suggested something approaching a species-wide migration. Entire underhives were being abandoned overnight. Derelict ships that had housed Hrud populations for generations were found empty, still radiating their temporal distortions, but devoid of life. Dead worlds that served as way stations for Hrud travelers showed signs of massive gatherings, millions of the creatures converging before vanishing without a trace. The Imperium's response to this phenomenon has been characteristically bureaucratic and slow. Sector commanders file reports that get lost in the vast machine of the administratum. Inquisitors investigate and die of old age before completing their research. The few who manage to piece together the larger picture find themselves facing the truth that nobody wants to hear. The Hrud know something. Something about the future, about what's coming, that has terrified them enough to risk exposure on a scale they've avoided for millions of years. There's a story, probably apocryphal but repeated in hushed tones among certain inquisitorial circles, about a librarian of the Ultramarines who captured a lone Hrud during a purge operation. The creature was wounded, unable to flee, and the librarian, desperate for intelligence, attempted to probe its mind with his psychic abilities. What he found wasn't thoughts or memories in any human sense, but sensations of time. He experienced moments that stretched into centuries, days that compressed into seconds. He felt the weight of millennia pressing down on consciousness that perceived past, present, and future as a single continuous stream. And in that stream, he saw what the Hrud saw. A darkness coming. Not the darkness of chaos or the shadow of the Tyranids, but something fundamental. An ending written into the fabric of reality itself. A moment when time would stop, not because it had reached its conclusion, but because it would be forced to stop. The librarian emerged from the psychic contact aged 50 years in the span of minutes, his hair white, his face lined, his eyes hollow. He lived for 3 more years, spending every day writing feverishly in journals that the Ultramarines sealed after his death. Only one phrase from those journals has ever been made public, copied by a serf who glimpsed a page before it was locked away. The phrase was simple, written over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting. They're not running away. They're running toward the last moment. No one knows what that means. But on 1,000 worlds across the Imperium, in the depths of hive cities and the darkness of abandoned facilities, the Hrud continue their impossible journey through time and space, carrying with them secrets that might explain not just their own fate, but the fate of everything that exists. And as their numbers dwindle and their temporal fields grow weaker, as if they're expending their very essence in this desperate flight, one question grows more urgent with each passing day. When the Hrud finally stop running, when they reach whatever destination they've been fleeing toward across the centuries, what will be waiting there? The answer came from an unlikely source, a place where few expected to find truth about anything, let alone about creatures as enigmatic as the Hrud. On the shrine world of Ophelia 7, in a monastery dedicated to preserving the testimonies of Imperial saints and prophets, a young scribe named Matthias discovered something that should have been impossible. He was cataloging texts from the Age of Apostasy, documents that had survived the flames of Sebastian Thor's Reformation, when he found a journal written by a man who claimed to have lived among the Hrud. The journal was dismissed initially as the ravings of a heretic or madman. After all, no human could survive prolonged exposure to the Hrud's temporal fields. But Matthias noticed something peculiar about the manuscript itself. Carbon dating placed its creation at approximately M36, consistent with the claimed date of writing. But the ink, the paper, the binding, All showed signs of age far beyond what should have been possible. The journal was somehow older than its creation date, as if it had experienced centuries of decay in the span of decades. It bore the temporal signature of Hrud exposure. The writer identified himself only as Carvel, a former Imperial Guard sergeant who had deserted his unit rather than face execution for questioning orders. Fleeing into the underhive of his world, he had stumbled upon a Hrud warren purely by accident. He should have died there, aged to dust in minutes. But he didn't. According to his account, a single Hrud approached him, and somehow impossibly, the temporal field around it stabilized. Time still moved strangely in its presence, but no longer at the catastrophic rate that would have killed him. Days became hours, hours became minutes, but he survived. Carvel's journal describes the months he spent in that warren, though he admits that his perception of time became so distorted, he could never be certain how long he was actually there. He learned to move through the shadows as the Hrud did, following them through passageways that seemed to exist between moments rather than in physical space. He witnessed their gatherings, watched them communicate through means he couldn't fully understand, gestures and sounds that conveyed meanings beyond simple language. And slowly, painfully, he began to grasp fragments of their story. The Hrud, according to Carvel's account, did not originate in this galaxy. They came from somewhere else, someone else, fleeing the catastrophe that had already destroyed their home, but hadn't yet occurred in the timeline they fled to. The paradox of this made Carvel's head ache when he tried to comprehend it. They were refugees from a future that would erase them, escaping to a past where they didn't belong, cursed to carry with them the temporal wounds of their own non-existence. He wrote about watching them construct their temporal machinery, devices that seemed to fold moments in on themselves, creating pockets where time moved differently or didn't move at all. The Hrud, he claimed, could perceive time as humans perceive space, seeing past and future laid out before them like a landscape they could navigate. But this perception came at a terrible cost. They experienced every moment of their lives simultaneously, birth and death occurring in the same eternal present, joy and suffering merged into a single continuous experience of existence. The most disturbing part of Carvel's account came toward the end of his journal, in entries that grew increasingly frantic and difficult to read. He described a change in the Hrud's behavior, an urgency that had gripped the entire warren. They were preparing for something, building larger temporal devices, gathering resources at a pace he'd never witnessed before. And one night, in the depths of the warren, they brought him before what he called a temporal nexus, a machine so vast and complex that it made the others look like children's toys. Inside the nexus, the Hrud showed him something. A vision, a prophecy, a memory of something that hadn't happened yet. Carvel's description becomes almost incomprehensible at this point, his language breaking down as he struggled to put into words what he had witnessed. He wrote of a moment when all moments would collapse into one, when the linear flow of time would cease and everything that ever was or would be would exist simultaneously. Not the warp, he insisted, not chaos, but something deeper, more fundamental. A cosmic reset, a universal reboot, the end and beginning of everything happening at once. And in that moment of convergence, Carvel saw what the Hrud were truly afraid of. It wasn't death. Their perception of time meant they experienced their deaths constantly anyway, always dying and always being born in the same eternal instant. What terrified them was erasure, complete and total. When time collapsed, when all moments became one moment, they would cease to have ever existed. Every moment of their existence across all timelines would be unmade, not just killed, but rendered retroactively non-existent. They would become a species that never was, shadows without a source, memories of something that never occurred. The journal ended abruptly. Carvel's final entry described the Hrud suddenly evacuating the warren, their temporal machinery activating at once, creating distortion so severe that he could feel himself aging and de-aging simultaneously. He wrote that he could see his own skeleton through his skin, see himself as a child and an old man and a corpse all at once. The last sentence was barely legible. They're going to the place where time ends. I think they want to die there, where death will mean something. When Matthias brought this journal to the attention of his superiors, they initially dismissed it as obviously fabricated. But then the Ordo Chronos took interest. This secretive branch of the Inquisition, dedicated to understanding and combating temporal anomalies, had been all but extinct since the Horus Heresy. Its members lost to time in ways that made their absence feel retroactive, as if they had never existed in the first place. But a few remained, operating in the shadows even deeper than those their organization once patrolled. And they recognized something in Carvel's account that made them act with uncharacteristic urgency. They knew where the Hrud were going. Or rather, they knew when. Deep in the Inquisition's most secure vaults, there existed predictions made by the God Emperor himself during the Great Crusade, calculations about the long-term stability of the galaxy's temporal structure. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had foreseen that the constant use of warp travel, combined with the birth and death of countless psychers, the opening and closing of warp rifts, the time-distorting effects of chaos itself, would create cumulative stress on the fabric of spacetime. Eventually, at some point in the far future, this stress would reach a critical threshold. Time itself would begin to break down, not catastrophically all at once, but in specific locations, moments where the flow of causality would become unstable. The Ordo Chronos had spent 10,000 years trying to monitor and prevent this breakdown, largely succeeding in keeping the worst effects contained. But they had always known that one day they would fail, that the breakdown would accelerate beyond their ability to control. According to their calculations, that day was approaching. Not in the immediate future, perhaps not for centuries or millennia, but approaching nonetheless. And the Hrud, with their unique perception of time, could sense it coming like animals sensing an earthquake before it strikes. But here was the truly horrifying part, the piece of information that made even hardened Inquisitors hesitate to speak aloud. The Hrud weren't just fleeing toward this temporal collapse, they were necessary for it. Their very existence, their temporal fields, their devices that folded and manipulated time, they were all contributing to the stress on spacetime's fabric. Every Hrud that existed accelerated the approach of the very catastrophe they feared. They were simultaneously the victims and the cause of their own erasure, trapped in a paradox that defined their entire existence. One Inquisitor, a woman named Helith, who had spent her entire career studying the Hrud, proposed a theory that was so disturbing it resulted in her immediate excommunication and execution. She suggested that the Hrud knew this, that they had always known, that their entire species was engaged in a form of cosmic suicide, deliberately accelerating time toward its breaking point because they believed something would be born from the collapse, something that would justify their sacrifice. She claimed they weren't fleeing in fear, but traveling toward their purpose, that every Hrud who died of old age in minutes rather than years, every Warren that collapsed under the weight of its own temporal distortions, was a willing participant in a plan that spanned millions of years. Before she was silenced, Helith managed to transmit one final message to her most trusted acolyte, a message that consisted of coordinates and a single question. What if the Hrud aren't destroying time, but saving it? The coordinates pointed to a region of space in the galactic east, beyond the light of the Astronomicon, in a sector so remote that no Imperial ship had traveled there in recorded history. When a covert Death Watch kill team was dispatched to investigate, they found something that defied all understanding. A planet, if it could be called that, existing in a state of temporal flux so severe that it appeared to occupy multiple points in time simultaneously. They could see it as it was, as it had been millions of years ago, and as it would be millions of years hence, all three versions overlaid on each other in the same physical space. And on that planet, in all three versions of it, the Hrud were gathering. Millions of them, perhaps billions more than the Imperium had ever suspected existed. They weren't building weapons or defenses. They were building a monument, a structure so vast it could be seen from orbit, constructed from materials that existed partially out of phase with normal reality. The structure's purpose was unknown, but its temporal signature was unmistakable. It was an anchor point, a place where time would remain stable even as everything around it collapsed into temporal chaos. The kill team's final transmission before all contact was lost consisted of a single observation that would haunt everyone who heard it. They're not trying to survive the end of time. They're trying to hold a moment in place. They're trying to save something. But what could be worth sacrificing an entire species to preserve? What single moment could be so important that the Hrud would spend millions of years, endure countless deaths, and ultimately erase themselves from existence just to keep it from being lost when time collapsed? The answer to that question was still hidden, buried in the temporal distortions and shadowy warrens where the Hrud dwelt. But somewhere in the minds of the Imperium's most brilliant and most disturbed thinkers, a terrifying possibility was beginning to take shape. What if the moment the Hrud were trying to save wasn't in their past or their future, but in humanity's? The possibility hung in the air of countless stratagem chambers and inquisitorial sanctums like a plague waiting to spread. If the Hrud were trying to preserve a moment in humanity's timeline, then everything the Imperium thought it understood about these creatures, about their motivations, about the threat they represented, was fundamentally wrong. They weren't the enemy. They were something far more complicated, far more tragic. They were guardians, perhaps, or witnesses, or something for which humanity had no adequate word. An emergency conclave was convened on Terra itself, in chambers so far beneath the Imperial Palace that even the light of the Astronomicon couldn't penetrate. Representatives from every major branch of the Inquisition attended, along with High Lords, Fabricator Generals, and even a handful of Space Marine chapter masters whose understanding of temporal mechanics exceeded most baseline humans. The meeting lasted for 3 days, though the participants emerged claiming it had felt like weeks, as if the very subject matter had infected the flow of time in the chamber itself. What they discussed was never formally recorded, but fragments have leaked over the years through channels both official and profoundly heretical. They spoke of something called the palimpsest event, a theoretical moment in galactic history so significant that its alteration or erasure would fundamentally reshape everything that came after. The Emperor, in his infinite foresight, had apparently anticipated such a moment and taken steps to ensure its occurrence would remain stable across all timelines. But the mechanisms he put in place were failing, corroded by 10,000 years of war, atrophy, and the constant pressure of chaos against reality itself. One theory suggested that the moment in question was the Emperor's unification of Terra, the foundation upon which the entire Imperium was built. If that moment could be altered retroactively, if the warlords of ancient Terra had triumphed instead, humanity would never have reached the stars. The species would have remained divided, weak, easy prey for the countless horrors waiting in the galaxy. Another theory proposed it was the Emperor's battle with Horus, that final confrontation where humanity's future hung by the thinnest of threads. Alter that moment, allow Horus to triumph completely rather than fall, and the Imperium would never have existed at all. But an elderly inquisitor named Covenant, a man who claimed to have studied the Hrud for longer than most of the conclave members had been alive, proposed something different. Something that made the chamber fall silent with a dread that transcended normal fear. He suggested the moment wasn't in humanity's past at all. It was in the future. Somewhere ahead, in a timeline that hadn't yet occurred but was nonetheless inevitable, there existed a moment upon which all of reality would hinge. A moment when a choice would be made, or a battle fought, or a truth revealed, that would determine not just humanity's survival, but the survival of time itself. And the Hrud, with their unique perception of temporal flow, had seen this moment from the very beginning of their exile into this timeline. They had been moving toward it across millions of years, sacrificing themselves bit by bit, creating the temporal anchors and monuments that would ensure this crucial moment could occur despite the breakdown of causality around it. They were maintaining the stage upon which humanity's final act would be performed. even though doing so meant their own certain extinction. Covenant presented evidence that took hours to fully articulate. Patterns in Hrud migration that corresponded not to current threats, but to future Imperial expansions, as if they were clearing paths humanity would need centuries hence. Temporal anchors planted in systems that seemed strategically worthless now, but would become crucial. Choke points in wars that hadn't yet begun. Even their attacks on Imperial forces, which had always seemed random and motiveless, showed a pattern when viewed across centuries. They targeted specific units, specific ships, specific individuals, always at moments when those targets were about to make decisions that would, according to Covenant's calculations, lead humanity away from the necessary future. The Hrud weren't humanity's enemies. They were its shepherds, guiding the species toward a destiny that only they could perceive, doing so at the cost of their own existence, unable to communicate their purpose, because the very act of revealing it might alter the timeline enough to invalidate everything they'd sacrificed to preserve. The implications were staggering and deeply, profoundly unsettling. It meant that every soldier who had aged to death fighting the Hrud, every colony that had fallen to their temporal fields, every space marine who had died ancient and withered in the darkness of their warrens, all of it had been necessary. Not in the sense that the Hrud wanted to kill these people, but in the sense that their deaths were part of the pattern, part of the tapestry of causality that led toward the moment that had to occur. But here was the question that split the conclave into factions that would debate violently for days. If the Hrud were right, if there truly was a crucial moment approaching that required their sacrifice and intervention, did humanity have the right to stop them? More importantly, did humanity have the right to know what that moment was? Some argued that ignorance was unacceptable. If the Imperium's fate hinged on a future event, then surely understanding that event was essential to ensuring humanity's survival. They proposed immediate mobilization, finding the Hrud gathering sites, capturing specimens, extracting the knowledge by any means necessary. Time was breaking down. The galaxy was fracturing. They needed to know what was coming so they could prepare for it. Others, Covenant among them, argued the opposite with a passion that bordered on desperation. They claimed that knowing would be catastrophic, that the moment only worked if humanity approached it without foreknowledge, making choices based on instinct and circumstance rather than predestination. The Hrud's sacrifice would be meaningless if humanity tried to force the moment rather than allowing it to unfold naturally. They compared it to watching a man walk toward a cliff in the fog. Warn him of the cliff, and he might turn back, but in turning back he might step off a different cliff that was previously safe behind him. Sometimes, they argued, the only way to survive was to keep walking forward without knowing what lay ahead. The debate was interrupted by news from the front lines, reports flooding in from a dozen sectors simultaneously. The Hrud weren't just gathering anymore, they were dying. Entire warrens were collapsing, their temporal fields destabilizing catastrophically. Hrud were being found in the thousands, their bodies aged beyond measure, as if they'd exhausted themselves completely. Some appeared to have experienced so much time that they'd literally worn away to nothing, leaving behind only outlines in the dust and faint temporal signatures that faded within hours. Whatever the moment was, whatever the Hrud had been preparing for across millennia, it was approaching, fast. An explorator fleet in the Ghoul stars detected temporal anomalies on a scale that dwarfed anything previously recorded. Space itself was beginning to fracture, moments from different eras bleeding into each other. They reported seeing ships that had been destroyed centuries ago appearing intact and operational, then vanishing as the temporal wound closed. They detected signals from the dark age of technology, voices speaking in ancient tongues about discoveries and terrors that predated the age of strife. One unfortunate crew member claimed to see herself, her own future self, standing on the bridge and weeping, though when asked why the future version was crying, she couldn't bring herself to answer before temporal backlash killed her, aging her 70 years in 7 seconds. The Astronomicon itself began flickering, not because of anything wrong with the beacon, but because time around Terra was becoming unstable. Navigators reported that routes through the warp were changing not based on warp currents, but on temporal shifts, as if the past and future of the galaxy's travel lanes were colliding with the present. Some ships arrived at their destinations before they had departed. Others never arrived at all, trapped in temporal loops where they would jump into the warp and arrive at their starting point in the same instant, doomed to repeat that moment forever. And through it all, the Hrud continued their march toward whatever destination they'd been seeking. The few Imperial forces that dared to follow them reported increasingly bizarre phenomena. Hrud were moving through spaces that shouldn't exist, walking through walls, not by phasing through matter, but by stepping through the seconds between moments, existing in the gaps of time rather than in time itself. Their caravan stretched across impossible distances, visible in multiple star systems simultaneously, as if space and time had ceased to be obstacles for them. One particularly brave or foolish Inquisitor managed to plant a tracking device on a Hrud migrant train, a piece of technology so advanced it could maintain cohesion even in severe temporal distortion. The data it transmitted back was fragmentary and often corrupted, but it revealed a destination, a region of space that Imperial records claimed was empty, a void between spiral arms where nothing should exist. Except something did exist there. The tracking device's final transmission, before it was destroyed by temporal stress beyond anything it was designed to withstand, included sensor readings of an object, massive, ancient, hollow, and radiating a temporal signature that matched, almost perfectly, the signature of the Golden Throne itself. The implications of this sent shockwaves through the Conclave. Was there another throne out there in the darkness? Something built by the Emperor in secret, or perhaps something that predated even him? Was it a backup, a failsafe, a prison, or something else entirely? And why were the Hrud, creatures who seemed to exist outside the Emperor's grand design, racing toward it with the last of their strength? Covenant made one final appeal to the Conclave before they voted on what to do. He stood in the center of that ancient chamber, a frail old man who had given his entire life to understanding creatures that most humans couldn't comprehend, and he spoke with a conviction that made even the High Lords pause. He said that humanity stood at a crossroads not of space or politics or war, but of time itself. The Hrud were offering a gift, he claimed, though it was wrapped in suffering and death. They were preserving a moment, creating a space in causality where humanity would have one chance to make a choice that mattered, one opportunity to determine its own fate rather than having that fate determined by chaos or Xenos or the simple entropy of the universe. But that opportunity only existed if humanity didn't grasp for it too eagerly, if the species allowed itself to be guided, rather than trying to seize control of its own destiny. The Hrud were dying to give humanity a future, but only if humanity was willing to walk into that future blind, trusting that when the moment came, when the choice presented itself, the right decision would be made not through planning or foreknowledge, but through the essential character of what it meant to be human. The chamber erupted in argument. Some called Covenant a heretic, claiming he was advocating for blind faith in Xenos creatures over the certainty of Imperial might. Others defended him, pointing out that 10,000 years of certain Imperial might had led to the current crisis, that perhaps uncertainty was precisely what humanity needed. The debate raged for hours, voices rising, accusations flying, ancient alliances fracturing under the weight of this impossible decision. And while they argued, while they debated humanity's future in chambers deep beneath the throne world, another signal reached Terra from the explorer fleet. Brief, panicked, fragmentary, just 4 words before the transmission cut off forever, lost to temporal distortion so severe it erased the speaker from existence retroactively, leaving behind only the echo of their final message. The throne is opening. Fleets mobilized across the Imperium within hours of that transmission. Not in organized formation or with proper strategic planning, but in desperate, chaotic rushes as every faction that had been present at the Conclave scrambled to reach that void between spiral arms. The Mechanicus and Explorator ships packed with their most advanced temporal monitoring equipment. The Inquisition dispatched kill teams and interrogators. 3 Space Marine chapters diverted their entire crusading forces toward the coordinates. Even the normally isolationist Adeptus Custodes deployed a small contingent, acting on orders that came directly from the throne room itself, suggesting that the Emperor, in whatever diminished state he existed, had foreseen this moment and deemed it worthy of his guardian's attention. The journey took weeks, and every day the reports grew more disturbing. Ships that traveled the same route at the same time arrived days or years apart. Some vessels experienced the journey as minutes, their crews confused when told weeks had passed. Others endured subjective years in transit, their food stores exhausted, their crews aged and traumatized, having lived entire lifetimes in the space between stars. The fabric of spacetime wasn't just fraying anymore. It was actively unraveling, coming apart at the seams like ancient cloth, finally succumbing to millennia of stress. When the first ships finally emerged from the warp at the destination coordinates, what they saw defied description. The void wasn't empty at all. It was full, crowded, packed with structures that existed in states of temporal superposition, buildings and machines and monuments that were simultaneously new and ancient, whole and destroyed, functioning and derelict. They occupied the same space at different times, creating a layered reality where the past, present, and future existed as distinct but overlapping dimensions. And at the center of it all, the throne. Not golden, not encrusted with the technological marvels of human ingenuity, but something far older and stranger. It appeared to be carved from solidified time itself, if such a thing could exist, its form shifting between states of existence too rapidly for human eyes to track. Sometimes it looked like a chair, sometimes like a coffin, sometimes like a doorway, and sometimes, for brief flickering instants, it looked occupied, though by what or whom no observer could clearly see. The Hrud were there, millions of them, perhaps the entire surviving population of their species. They formed concentric circles around the throne, each ring vibrating at a different temporal frequency, creating a harmony of distorted time that somehow stabilized the chaos around it. They weren't moving anymore. They were still, perfectly still, locked in place like statues. And they were dying. Not slowly, not peacefully, but burning themselves out like candles guttering in the wind, their temporal fields consuming them from within as they channeled everything they were, everything they had ever been or would ever be, into maintaining stability around that ancient throne. Covenant was aboard one of the first ships to arrive, and he immediately ordered landing parties to hold position. He understood what he was seeing in a way that others couldn't, his decades of study finally crystallizing into comprehension. The Hrud weren't just preserving a moment, they were creating one, carving out a space and causality where something impossible could occur, something that required the laws of time to be temporarily suspended, held at bay by the collective sacrifice of an entire species. The throne began to open. Not physically, though that was part of it. It opened temporally, peeling back layers of existence to reveal what lay beneath. And what lay beneath was a moment. A single frozen instant pulled from somewhere in time's flow and preserved here, held in stasis by mechanisms so ancient and complex that even the Mechanicus tech priests could only stare in awe and incomprehension. Inside that moment, a scene played out, visible to all who watched but somehow also distant, untouchable, as if they were viewing it through infinite layers of glass. A throne room. The Imperial palace on Terra, but not the Terra of the present, nor any Terra from recorded history. The architecture was different, older, and yet somehow also newer, more vital. And on the throne sat not the Emperor as the Imperium knew him, desiccated and barely alive, but the Emperor as he had been, whole, powerful, radiant with psychic might that made reality itself bend around him. And standing before him, a figure in black armor, Horus. But this wasn't the moment of their final battle. This was before, long before, a conversation perhaps, an argument. Words were being exchanged, though no sound carried across the temporal barrier. The Emperor was gesturing, explaining something, his expression troubled in a way that made him seem almost human. And Horus was listening, his face showing emotions that would later be burned away by chaos. Doubt, fear, confusion, and beneath it all, something that looked dangerously like love. This was the moment, not the battle, not the betrayal. This was before all of that, the conversation that set everything in motion, the words that would eventually tear the galaxy apart and birth the Imperium in blood and fire. The moment when the Emperor told his favored son something that would drive Horus to damnation. But the scene was corrupted. Fragments of it were missing, eaten away by temporal decay like rust on ancient metal. Entire sections flickered in and out of existence. The words being spoken were lost, whatever the Emperor said to Horus erased by 10,000 years of temporal stress. This was what the Hrud had been trying to preserve, this conversation that explained everything, that made sense of the Heresy and the Imperium and perhaps the entire human condition. But they were failing. Even their sacrifice wasn't enough. The moment was dying, dissolving, taking with it any chance of understanding why things had happened the way they did. Covenant understood then what was required, what had always been required. The Hrud couldn't save this moment alone because they weren't part of it. It belonged to humanity, and only humanity could preserve it. But doing so would require a sacrifice to match what the Hrud had already given. Someone would need to step into that moment, become part of it, anchor it to the present through their own existence. They would be frozen there forever, experiencing that single instant across all eternity, holding it in place while time flowed on around them. It would be a death without dying, a life without living. Whoever entered that moment would cease to exist in any meaningful sense, becoming a temporal anchor point, a fixed coordinate in the storm of causality. They would never age, never change, never move forward or backward. They would simply be forever witnessing the conversation between father and son. The words that broke the galaxy, unable to hear those words, but preserving them nonetheless for some future moment when they might be recovered and understood. Several volunteers stepped forward immediately. Space Marines who saw it as the ultimate sacrifice for the Emperor. Inquisitors who believed understanding this moment was worth any personal cost. Even a handful of Mechanicus priests who viewed it as the greatest experiment in temporal mechanics ever attempted. But Covenant waved them all back. He had known, from the moment he first theorized what the Hrud were doing, that this moment would come. And he had known that it would have to be him. Not because he was special or uniquely qualified, but because he was old. So old, he had spent his entire life, more than 3 centuries of it, studying the Hrud, trying to understand their purpose. And now he finally did. They had been waiting for someone to make this choice, preserving the moment as best they could until a human finally understood what was required and was willing to pay the price. His life's work had led him here, to this void between stars, to this ancient throne, to this choice that was somehow both terrible and beautiful. He walked forward before anyone could stop him, his old body moving with surprising grace. The Hrud, though still conscious enough to perceive his approach, parted their circles to let him pass. As he drew closer to the throne, to the frozen moment it contained, he could feel time beginning to solidify around him. His heartbeat slowed, his thoughts stretched. Each step took longer than the last, not because he was moving slowly, but because the seconds themselves were expanding, becoming thick and viscous. He reached the threshold of the moment and paused, turning back to look at the assembled Imperial forces one last time. His mouth moved, forming words that would take subjective hours to speak, but would be heard in an instant by those watching. A final message, a testament, a benediction. He told them that the Hrud had saved humanity more times than anyone would ever know, guiding it through temporal catastrophes that would have erased the species from existence. He said that their sacrifice should be remembered, honored, not as the deaths of aliens, but as the sacrifice of guardians who loved humanity enough to die for it, despite never being loved in return. And then he stepped through, into the moment, and became part of it. His form froze mid-stride, 1 foot forward, his hand reaching toward the scene of Emperor and Horus, his face showing an expression of peace and acceptance that would remain unchanged for the rest of time. The moment stabilized immediately, its decay halting as Covenant's existence anchored it to the present. The corrupted section stopped spreading. The flickering ceased. It was still damaged, still incomplete, but it was stable. It would endure. The Hrud began to collapse. Their task complete, they had nothing left to sustain them. They fell in waves, their temporal fields guttering out like dying stars, their bodies aging to dust in seconds. But as they died, something remarkable happened. Their temporal fields, those zones of accelerated entropy that had killed so many humans, began to synchronize. They merged, creating a final unified field that washed outward from the throne in a wave of carefully calibrated time. Every ship in the assembled fleet felt it. Every person aboard those ships experienced a moment of temporal clarity, a brief instant where they could perceive time as the Hrud did, stretched out before them like a landscape. They saw their own pasts, their futures, the moments that had led them here and the moments that would follow. They saw the Imperium's history, not as a sequence of events, but as a single vast tapestry where every moment existed simultaneously. And for just that instant, they understood. They understood what the Hrud had been trying to save and why. Then the moment passed. The field collapsed. The Hrud were gone, their species extinct, sacrificed completely to preserve a conversation that might someday explain everything or might explain nothing at all. The throne remained, with Covenant frozen before it, a human monument to match the Hrud's sacrifice. And around it, the temporal distortions began to subside, stability slowly returning to the sector as the crisis that had been building for millennia finally reached its resolution. In the silence that followed, aboard ships filled with soldiers and priests and scholars who had just witnessed something beyond their comprehension, a single question hung in the air, unspoken but universally felt. Now what? The Imperial fleets remained in position for 3 days, though aboard the ships the passage of time felt inconsistent, elastic. Some crews swore it had been hours. Others felt weeks had crawled by in the silent void. They maintained a perimeter around the throne, not guarding it exactly, but bearing witness. There was a sense, unspoken but universally acknowledged, that simply leaving felt wrong, disrespectful to both Covenant and the Hrud, who had given everything to make this moment possible. So they stayed, and they watched. And they tried to process what they had witnessed. The Mechanicus were the first to break the silence, sending servitors and carefully shielded tech priests to study the throne and the moment it contained. Their findings were inconclusive by design, the system so far beyond current Imperial technology that any attempt to fully understand them would require centuries of study. But they could confirm one thing: the moment was stable. Whatever Covenant had done by stepping into it, whatever transformation had occurred when his existence merged with that frozen fragment of time, it had worked. The conversation between Emperor and Horus would remain preserved, locked away but not lost, waiting for some future age when humanity might possess the wisdom or the technology to retrieve it without destroying it in the process. The Space Marines held a vigil, each chapter taking turns to position battle brothers around the perimeter in shifts that seemed to have no practical purpose, but satisfied some deep spiritual need. They weren't guarding anything. There was nothing left to guard against. The Hrud were gone, extinct, and with them went the temporal threat they had both represented and protected against. But the Marines stood watch anyway, treating the site as they would a holy shrine, which perhaps it was. A monument to sacrifice, both human and Xenos, to the strange and terrible bargains that survival sometimes demanded. It was an Inquisitor named Severina, not related to the rogue trader who had first discovered the Hrud Ark ship, but bearing the name with conscious intention, who first proposed what would become known as the Covenant Doctrine. She argued that the Imperium's understanding of Xenos had always been too simplistic, too binary. Humanity had divided the galaxy into human and alien, loyal and traitor, useful and threatening. But the Hrud proved that reality was far more complex. Here was a species that had existed for millions of years, that had possessed technology and knowledge that dwarfed humanity's achievements, and that had chosen to use all of that power not for conquest or survival, but for guardianship. They had died protecting a moment in humanity's history, preserving the conversation between humans about human concerns, asking nothing in return except the chance to complete their self-appointed task. The doctrine she proposed was radical, heretical, even by the standards of an organization that regularly dealt with heresy. She suggested that the Imperium should reconsider its stance on certain Xenos species. Not all of them certainly, but those few that had demonstrated through action rather than words that their interests aligned with humanity's survival. The Hrud had proved that aliens could love humanity enough to die for it. That fact alone demanded a response more nuanced than simple extermination. The proposal was debated for months in chambers and councils across the Imperium. Most rejected it outright, citing 10,000 years of Imperial doctrine that clearly stated humanity's superiority and the necessity of Xenos' extinction. But a minority, a small but growing faction, argued that perhaps the Emperor himself would have approved. After all, during the Great Crusade he had shown pragmatism, working with some alien species when it served his purposes, even as he destroyed others. And if the moment the Hrud had preserved was as important as everyone suspected, if it truly held the key to understanding the heresy and perhaps preventing future betrayals, then surely the Emperor would have wanted it saved by any means necessary. No official policy changed. The Imperium remained steadfast in its xenophobia, its absolute conviction that humanity stood alone against a hostile galaxy. But quietly, in certain sectors, in certain operations, Inquisitors and commanders began to exercise more discretion. When Hrud remnants were discovered, those few survivors who had not joined the Great Migration to the Void Throne, some Imperial forces chose to observe rather than attack. They watched these last scattered groups, noting that without the pressure of their species-wide mission, the Hrud seemed different somehow. Their temporal fields were weaker, more controlled. They didn't attack Imperial positions unprovoked. They simply existed in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, like ghosts haunting ruins, the last remnants of a species that had completed its purpose and now had nothing left to do but slowly fade away. On Terra, in the depths beneath the Imperial Palace, the Conclave reconvened one final time to hear testimony from those who had been present at the Void Throne. The witnesses described what they had seen, the moment between Emperor and Horus, frozen and incomplete, but undeniably real. They spoke of Covenant sacrifice and the Hrud's extinction. And they grappled with the implications of it all, the uncomfortable truth that humanity's survival might owe more to alien intervention than anyone wanted to admit. One detail emerged in these testimonies that had gone largely unnoticed in the immediate aftermath. Several observers reported that in the last seconds before the Hrud died, before their species winked out of existence entirely, they had turned toward the assembled Imperial forces. And in that final moment, through means that no one could adequately explain, they had conveyed something. Not words, not even thoughts exactly, but a feeling. A transmission of pure emotion that bypassed language and species and understanding to communicate directly from one form of consciousness to another. What they conveyed was gratitude. The Hrud had spent millions of years in exile, fleeing through time from a catastrophe that had destroyed their original timeline, watching humanity from the shadows and protecting it from temporal threats it never knew existed. They had endured isolation and fear and the constant acceleration of entropy that defined their existence. They had been hated and hunted and killed by the very species they were protecting. And in the end, as they burned themselves out completely to preserve a single human moment, they had felt grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to serve a purpose, to mean something, to die for a cause greater than simple survival. That gratitude, more than anything else, was what haunted the witnesses. It suggested a depth of nobility and selflessness that challenged everything the Imperium taught about Xenos' nature. If aliens could feel that kind of gratitude, that kind of love for a species not their own, then what did that say about humanity's relationship with the galaxy? Were humans really the sole bearers of consciousness and morality in a hostile universe? Or were they simply one species among many, all struggling to find meaning and purpose in the face of an indifferent cosmos? These questions had no easy answers, and the Imperium was not an institution designed to entertain philosophical ambiguity. So the questions were filed away, archived in the same deep vaults where the knowledge of the Void Throne was stored, available to those with clearance and curiosity but hidden from the general population who needed simpler truths to sustain their faith. But the questions persisted nonetheless, carried by those who had witnessed the Hrud's sacrifice, passed along in whispered conversations and coded reports. They spread slowly through the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, a quiet virus of doubt and wonder that infected the thoughts of scholars and soldiers alike. And perhaps that was the real gift the Hrud had given humanity, not the preserved moment or the prevented temporal catastrophe, but the question itself, the challenge to certainty, the reminder that the universe was larger and stranger than even the Imperium's vast archives could contain. Years passed, then decades. The Void Throne became a pilgrimage site for a select few, those Inquisitors and Space Marines and Tech Priests who sought to understand what had happened there and what it meant for humanity's future. They would stand before Covenant's frozen form, watching the incomplete conversation between Emperor and Horus play out in its endless loop, and they would wonder, what words had been spoken in that moment? What truth had the Emperor shared that drove his favorite son to betrayal? Would knowing those words prevent future heresies, or would the knowledge itself create new fractures in the Imperium's foundation? The answers remained locked away, waiting. And perhaps they would wait forever, the moment preserved but never recovered, a mystery that would outlast empires and species and the very stars themselves. Or perhaps one day, when humanity had evolved beyond its current limitations, when the Imperium had transformed into something wiser and more compassionate, someone would finally step forward with the knowledge and courage necessary to retrieve what Covenant and the Hrud had saved. Someone would unlock that frozen moment and hear the words that explained everything. But that day had not yet come and might never come, and maybe that was exactly as it should be. Maybe the lesson wasn't in the answers but in the questions themselves, in the act of sacrifice rather than its product. The Hrud had taught humanity something profound through their extinction, that some truths were worth dying to preserve, even if you never lived to see them revealed. That guardianship was its own reward. That love could transcend species and time and understanding to create something beautiful and terrible and utterly necessary. In the underhives and forgotten spaces where the last Hrud still dwelt, life continued in its strange, attenuated way. These remnants lived quietly, their temporal fields barely perceptible, their presence almost ghostly. They built nothing, sought nothing, wanted nothing except to exist for whatever brief span remained to them. And sometimes, when Imperial citizens ventured into those dark places and caught glimpses of hunched figures wrapped in shadow, they would pause instead of fleeing. They would remember the stories, if they had heard them, of the species that died to save a human moment. And instead of firing their weapons, they would offer a nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of respect, before moving on. It wasn't much. It couldn't bring back the millions of Hrud who had sacrificed themselves, couldn't restore their species or repay their gift, but it was something. A small crack in the Imperium's xenophobic armor, a tiny seed of understanding planted in hostile soil, and seeds, given time, could grow into things no one expected. The galaxy turned, the Imperium fought its endless wars. The forces of chaos pressed against reality's boundaries. The Tyranid hive fleets continued their inexorable advance. And through it all, in a void between spiral arms, an old man stood frozen before an ancient throne, holding a moment in place, bearing witness to a conversation that might explain everything or nothing, accompanied by the memory of an extinct species that had loved humanity enough to die for it. And perhaps in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. Not what was said between Emperor and Horus, not what caused the heresy or how it might have been prevented, but simply this, that love and sacrifice could exist even in a galaxy defined by war and hatred. That meaning could be found not in victory or survival, but in the choice to protect something larger than yourself, even at the cost of everything you were. The Hrud understood that. Covenant understood that. And now, slowly, quietly, against all institutional resistance and doctrinal certainty, the Imperium was beginning to understand it too. The knowledge would take generations to spread, centuries to take root, and might never transform imperial policy in any meaningful way. But it existed now, a small light in the darkness, a reminder that the universe contained possibilities beyond mere survival and domination. And in that reminder, there was hope. Not the bright, naive hope of victory and triumph, but the darker, more resilient hope of meaning and purpose. The hope that sacrifice mattered, that guardianship had value, that even extinction could serve a purpose if it protected something worth preserving. That hope would endure long after the last Hrud had faded from existence, long after Covenant's name was forgotten by all but the most diligent historians, long after the throne itself had crumbled to dust. It would endure because it had been purchased with the ultimate price, preserved in the very fabric of time itself, waiting for the moment when humanity would finally be ready to accept the gift it had been given. And maybe, just maybe, that moment was closer than anyone realized.